Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our regulars. Welcome to any new people this week. And welcome also to people listening on J-Air. We're now streaming these Australian Jewish Association Zoom sessions via Facebook and audio only on J-Air Jewish Community Radio in Melbourne. That's 88 FM or j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I will be your MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest tonight, Jonathan Spire, who we will formally introduce in a moment. Our format will be pretty much as we've done before. What we're going to do is have a short presentation from Jonathan for about 10 minutes, which will be followed by some questions from David and I, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. And if you've been on Zoom sessions at all in the last year or so, you'll know all about that. What we ask you to do is indicate that you want to ask a question by electronically raising your hand. And the way to do that is click on the reactions icon down the bottom, and that will give us a signal, and I'll put you into the list to ask you questions. Now, as we're now also doing, if you prefer to submit a written question, then this can be done on the chat function, and we will read out some of those questions in between the spoken ones. This will be done by Robert Gregory, our Research and Advocacy Officer. He will be the moderator of the written questions, and he may even combine one or two if they're on similar themes. And of course, sometimes our speakers will answer questions on some issue during the discussion, so in that case we won't repeat the question. A reminder also that the chat function is working, and if you're not familiar with Zoom, up in the top right hand corner there is a little icon which says view, and you can toggle between speaker view and gallery view, whatever you like. Okay, so these days Iran is a worry in the Middle East and China is a worry on a global scale. So the question is it even a bigger worry when these two powers get together, as they seem to have been doing? What does it mean for Iran's nuclear ambitions? How does it affect Israel? And does Turkey factor into this as well? To help us understand this emerging development, we're joined by Dr. Jonathan Spire, a well-known writer, analyst and journalist focusing on the Levant and Middle East strategic affairs. He is a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies, and we actually have Ephraim Inbar returning as a guest in the next few weeks. And he's a fellow at the Middle East Forum and a freelance security analyst and correspondent at IHS James. Jonathan is not one of those journalists who sits in his office very much. He is very often in the thick of the action, which must make his family very nervous every time he says he's packing up to go somewhere in some area in the world that many journalists prefer to avoid. His work is published all over the place, including our newspapers, and he consults and advises for a variety of bodies and government NGOs, as well as the private sector. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us tonight, and welcome back to Australia, this time via Zoom.
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks for the invitation. So I'll get straight to it.
Yes, please.
To giving what I hope will be a kind of overview, which will then, of what I see at least as the kind of key strategic pattern and process and trends in the region, and then we can, in questions, drill down into particular areas that interest people. So it's been customary among many Middle East analysts, myself included in recent years, to see the region as broadly divided into four blocks or alliances of varying strengths and sizes and abilities. And I want to first of all outline those four alliances, which I think remain useful, not perfect, but useful tools for understanding the region. And then I'll look briefly at how things may be changing with the entry or exit of new powers in the region, specifically the United States and China. Four main blocks. Who are we talking about? Firstly, the block of countries and movements associated with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we will include, of course, in that block Iran itself, the Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, the Houthi movement, or Ansar Allah, which controls roughly half of Yemen, the Islamic Jihad movement among the Palestinians, to a lesser or more complex extent, the Hamas enclave in Gaza, and the Iraqi Shia militias. That's one bloc. It's a bloc whose purpose is to advance the cause of Iranian hegemony across the region. It's a bloc which controls, in addition to Iran, effectively 3 or 3.5 other Arab countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and half of Yemen. And it is, of course, of great interest to us here this evening because it is a bloc centered around a country with nuclear ambitions whose cause is, or whose objective is, the ending of and destruction of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. That's block number one. Block number two is a broad, which will interest us a great deal this evening for reasons we'll go on to see, is a broad, loose conglomeration of broadly Western aligned countries who are opposed to Iran and who are opposed also to Sunni political Islam. In this very broad and loose gathering, we would include Israel itself, the United Arab Emirates, the Republic of Egypt, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Bahrain, and also as lesser partners, the Kingdom of Morocco, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and probably broadly as non-state actors such as the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, and perhaps also, if we're feeling particularly generous, the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas. Block number three is the block of Sunni political Islam, consisting of the Muslim Brotherhood style, consisting of the Republic of Turkey, the Emirate of Qatar, to some degree also the Hamas enclave in Gaza, which has its foot in 2 camps, and the Government of National Accord of Fayez Sarraj in Tripoli in Libya. And block number 4, less importantly, we should mention it, is the block of Salafi Jihadi political Islam. That is to say, the organizations such as Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda regional network. 4 alliances of varying size, of varying strength, in competition with one another for the future of the region. Now, that's a slightly simplistic position in the sense that there are overlaps in the bloc, which of course people here will be noting. But I think broadly, this is a useful analytic tool for understanding the region. Now, in recent years, the last 3 or 4 years, some analysts have been saying, yeah, this is not a good enough picture anymore, because as a result of the American withdrawal from the region, which began with the Obama administration, continued throughout the Trump years and continues in the Biden years, the pro-Western alliance, the one we talked about, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, can no longer really be talked about as an alliance anymore. Because as a result of American drawdown and loss of faith in American backing by traditionally American aligned countries, what's happening now, some analysts say, is that American allies are beginning to try to hedge their bets. No longer confident of belonging to a strong US bloc, for example, such analysts will say, Saudi Arabia is now engaged in a process of negotiation with Iran, not of seeking to challenge the Iranian advance, but rather, insofar as it's possible, seeking to accommodate it. Similarly, such analysis will say, the United Arab Emirates is today, as for the last 2 years, been engaged in a process of negotiation with Iran as a result of Iranian aggression, responding to Iranian aggression with hope for appeasement. And if we think, for example, if we cast our minds back to late 2019, with the attack on Emirati and Saudi shipping outside the Fujairah port on the sea next to Emirates, next to Dubai, and the Emirati response being to send a delegation to negotiate with the Iranians rather than to respond to them with force or with condemnation. This is an indication of the things we're seeing. Same with United Arab Emirates reopening its embassy in Damascus in 2018. A further indication, such analysis would say, of a sort of breakdown of the pro-Western alliance, which arguably such analysis would say, I'm about to take issue with it, but so analysis would say, arguably threatens to leave Israel isolated, still challenging Iran with no choice but to do so, while other regional powers desert the camp, so to speak, and seek to accommodate or appease the Iranians. Now, that's a broad picture of what's supposed to be happening. And we factor in, Ellen mentioned China at the beginning. I wrote recently about increasing links between Iran and China. Of course, just a month ago, and this is what precipitated my article, the Iranians joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, after having been trying to do so for the last half decade. Of course, last year, the Iranians and China announced a very large-scale 25-year program of investment that's supposed to bring $400 billion of Chinese investment into Iran over the next quarter century. So there's a sort of movement, a corresponding entry of China in the region, into the region, an attempt by the Iranians to align themselves closer with the Chinese. Now, just to conclude, because it's a very broad, very quick overview here, but just to conclude that, and importantly, really to conclude, I take issue with the view that the pro-Western alliance is in a process of dismantling itself or dissipating. Yes, America is drawing down from our region, and there's no question that that is taking place. But the point is that it's not going to be, as it's becoming increasingly clear, it's not going to be possible for countries to appease Iran. It's not going to be possible for countries to reach accommodation with Iran, because the nature of Iranian ambitions are at a level and to an extent to which countries simply cannot accommodate themselves to it without effectively ceding their own vital interests and to some degree their own sovereignty. So if we look at what's actually happening, we see, for example, in just recent days, yes, Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking, but in just recent days, the Saudis and the Emiratis have removed their embassies, their ambassadors rather, from Lebanon, from Iran-controlled Lebanon, concluding that it's no longer useful or possible to engage with a country which is effectively controlled by Hezbollah. Similarly, the Emiratis want out of the Yemeni war, but they haven't been able to pull out of it entirely because they, like others, cannot accommodate the possibility of the Houthis and therefore the Iranians reaching the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the southwest of Yemen, which would enable them then to disrupt shipping heading towards the Suez. So the point is there are core interests at stake, in my view at least, which when the present period of flux, which undoubtedly is taking place because of the American drawdown. But when the present period of flux settles itself, it will settle itself into a pattern in which the continued association of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others will still constitute a vital security alignment in the region, driven by interests, not sentiment, not ideology, which will continue, in my own view, and we can go on to discuss this, to constitute the vital bulwark, if one can put it that way, the vital sort of force that will serve the broader Western interest, even in the absence of the kind of close US involvement inland and upstream in our region, which has characterized largely the last 2 decades, and which is undoubtedly now ceasing to be a factor. So I was asked to speak in 10 minutes. I've done about 13 minutes. I could do a lot more, of course. It's a very broad whistle-stop tour, but I hope that gives us some sort of broad contours within which we can now kind of drill down and look more closely at issues that people may wish to address.
Okay, David.
Jonathan, look, thank you very much for that overview, which was in part optimistic, and I'll ask about that at the moment. But I want to start with China, because from an Australian point of view, China is coming very large in terms of security, in terms of trade challenges. We hear that Israel has a degree of essential infrastructure tied up with China, ports. I don't know if it's the railway as well. Could you comment on the extent of important Israeli infrastructure which has Chinese involvement, and whether you see that as a particular threat?
Yeah, first of all, there is considerable Chinese investment in Israeli infrastructure. A private port has been constructed in Haifa, a similar private port in the larger port of Ashdod. Also, Chinese involvement in the construction of the light railway system in Tel Aviv. These are just 3 examples, and there are a considerable number of others. Yeah, the Chinese are here. Look, I mean, as you know, and as everybody here knows, it is the core, in a way, the core Chinese international strategy is to try to build trade hubs, build trade hubs across a region, and then to try to link them up. That's what the Chinese are doing globally. And of course, the Middle East, the route, which is the route from Central Asia through the Middle East to the Mediterranean Sea is vital, is a vital trade way for the Chinese. Israel, I think, has been complacent in recent years. I don't think this. I think this is generally acknowledged. Israel has been complacent in recent years regarding the potential negative security implications of some of this. Obviously, China is a massive potential market for Israel. There is a lot of synergy in a lot of areas that Israel does very well, whether it's health technology, agricultural technology, and other areas we could talk about. So there's been a sense of wanting to exploit the opportunity without being quite sufficiently aware of the threat. I think that is shifting now. It's beginning to shift. I know that in defense and security circles here today, there is awareness of what it means when you allow China into your country, in terms of what that can mean in terms of vacuuming up of information and corrupting your research sector, and even in the case of the Haifa national ports, creating hard potential security threats in terms of intelligence gathering capacity and so on. The system is beginning to respond to this. It hasn't yet responded quick enough. Famously, Prime Minister Netanyahu created an oversight committee through which all potential large-scale investments from China were supposed to go through. The committee was essentially toothless. There is now talk of moving the committee over to the National Security Council. The National Security Council, as people here I think probably know, sits in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, and Eyal Cholata, the current official heading it, is a very, very powerful and consequential part of Israeli governance. So it would mean a lot if that committee were to come under the oversight of Eyal Cholata or whoever will be the head of the National Security Council, so that this issue can start to properly be addressed. As I say, it's very much unlike in Australia, where of course for you, this is a key and present threat. For us, there are other key and present threats. There has been a kind of reluctance, by the way, not only on Israel's part, but on the part of United Arab Emirates as well, Israel's key strategic ally, I would say, in the region. There's been a reluctance to lose some of the potential benefits of a relationship with China by coming down too strongly on the side of the US in an emergent Cold War. I think there's increasingly a sense that, well, there's not going to be a choice about that. And the system is slowly, but too slowly, starting to accommodate itself towards that reality.
Is China involved in any high tech in Israel, telecommunications, for example, or air transport? Or
air transport, not from what I was aware of. 5G, of course, they wanted to come in Israel, as far as I'm aware, has prevented that as a result of the United States admonitions to do so. The issue, what tends to happen here, is that the Americans are the key force in stopping us, frankly, from going further into this, because the Americans come and sort of bang on the table. And that was, from what I'm told at least, a very large part of the recent visit of the US National Security Advisor to Israel just a month or so ago. The Americans bang on the table about this. The problem is, of course, is the Israeli response to it, which is a reasonable one as well, is Israeli business people or others will say, yeah, a lot of the companies that the Americans don't want us to trade with, the Americans themselves are trading with. Because, of course, the American economy is deeply involved with China, to a very high percentage. This is not, so it's complex. This is not like the old Cold War, where, there was a kind of closed economic system facing us, and the borderlines were drawn very clearly. The Americans are deeply economically engaged with the People's Republic of China. So Israel is concerned, well, so you don't want us to do it. One, you're doing it yourselves. Secondly, are you proposing an alternative? Are you able to actually show us companies that can do the stuff with a similar price that the Chinese are proposing? Yeah, and often the Americans can't. So these things are very, very real. But what I do think, and there are discussions to be had on the detail, but I do think there has been undoubtedly a complacency in Israel here in recent years. And I'm happy to say that I think that's starting to change. The awareness of the potential dangers in this is becoming more and more apparent. Because as you guys know very, very well, at the end of the day, an embassy of the People's Republic of China doesn't operate in the same way that normal embassies do. They don't appreciate the kind of norms and rules and boundaries that generally govern the relations between countries. And so at a certain point, you have to start addressing that. A very good friend of mine, an Indian diplomat here, always says that, you know, his sense with Israel was Israelis would say, yeah, look, you got to understand, man, we're not Pakistan. You know, we're not Sri Lanka. We're not idiots. We weren't born yesterday. We're not about to be taken for a ride by these guys. And the Indian guy would say, yeah, you don't actually know much about these guys. You know, it's easy. Well, we're not idiots. They won't take us for a ride. You know, we won't end up with a you know, in debt slavery to the Chinese. Fine, but don't be complacent. Don't be arrogant. Get to know who these guys actually are and understand, you know, putting in place effective ways to just take care of business and take care of interests. I think we're starting to do it, but there's a long way to go.
Okay. Jonathan, to switch subjects, most people would regard Iran as the biggest existential threat to Israel. One of the things that's I find most peculiar is that Israel seems absolutely committed to preventing Iran getting nuclear weapons, reasonable. And there's been so much flagrant breaching of the JCPOA, and yet European countries and probably the Biden administration, you know, seem to continually want to massage into the JCPOA again, or Mark II. How do you explain that, and how do you see things progressing?
I think that, frankly, with regard to many European countries, in a way, maybe it's similar to the answer I gave before about Israel and China, that many European countries, Western European countries, just don't really regard Iran as a security threat to them. They just don't think so. And I've had these kind of talks with European diplomats where we've put our case regarding Israel, and they'll just eventually come to the point of saying, yeah, well, we kind of get why you're worried about the Iranians, but we're just not that worried about them. You know, we've got maybe a Sunni jihadi threat on our streets in France or Holland or England or Germany. We haven't got a Shia Islamist threat. So we're not bothered. Now, it's very, very short-sighted. Actually, they do have a security threat on their streets from Iranian activities, as is now clear from recent cases in Paris and in the Netherlands and in Denmark of, you know, Iranian terror activity on the soil of Europe. So they do have a problem. But that's the point they would say was, we don't really think of Iran as being a problem. Certainly the French and the Germans see Iran as a major business opportunity as well. So what they tended to be was complacent as, okay, in 2015, a deal was signed. It seems to be okay. It gives us at least a decade or a decade and a half. Let's just sort of see how it goes. And then, of course, in 2018, when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA. So now the European point of view will be, well, you know, you withdrew from the JCPOA. So from what point of view are you now condemning the Iranians from also withdrawing from, partially at least, the adherence to the JCPOA? So I think there's always been a complacency there and a lack of awareness of the threat level. The problem we now have, or not us, the problem they now have, of course, people who want to have that position, is that Iran also now is no longer that interested in the JCPOA, and clearly isn't in any hurry to sort of sign off on anything with Biden and Robert Malley in Vienna. If it had been up to Biden and Malley, they'd have happily just re-signed on the going back to the existing JCPOA conditions of 2018. But Iran has already now unilaterally moved beyond that situation and has indeed, for example, enriched uranium today to 20% and to 60% levels. But the overall quantity possessed by Iran is now vastly outside of the maximum allowed by the JCPOA. So the Iranians would have to go a long, long way back just to become once again compliant with the JCPOA. And it looks like they're not that interested in doing so. So the answer is, what's happening right now is that Iran appears to be, you know, going headlong towards at least threshold nuclear capacity status. The JCPOA is increasingly irrelevant. The Europeans are increasingly invisible. And the US administration doesn't have, as we're very clearly seeing, a credible plan B, other than just saying we'd really like the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table in Vienna. And that's quite a worrying situation, because that does, to some degree, leave Israel and its various allies in the region alone. And on this, I go back to the first point I made, or the point I made in my opening remarks, which is that these are the kind of factors that drive Israel, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Bahrain back together again, in spite of, you know, the US withdrawal and the other areas we talked about before.
Okay. Alan, do you want to share?
Yes, thanks, David. Jonathan, in his speech to the the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You mentioned that Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi told them that hegemony and unilateralism have failed. What did he mean? What was he trying to say to the people with this statement?
What he's trying to say, I think, is he's trying to invite the Chinese to take on the role that Iran and other traditionally anti-Western forces in our region very much hope they will assume in the years ahead. As say, what he's saying is the Americans are withdrawing, you, China, are a rising global power. We invite you to become the head of a group of states, also in the Middle East, who will be frontally opposed to the Western interest and to Western aligned interests. That's what Raisi wants. The Iranian media talks about this all the time. And indeed, pro-Iran media in the region talks about this all the time. The question, of course, is whether the Chinese will take up the invitation. And that's a much more complex question because the Chinese have their own interests, have their own reasons to not necessarily want to get behind this or that radical force opposed to the Americans, don't necessarily want to get into confrontation with the Americans. But Raisi's desire and the desire of those around him, and let's just be clear once more, President Rouhani, who was never very important, but President Rouhani is long gone. There's an openly hard line across the board regime in Iran right now, and Raisi is part of that. And what those guys want and talk about all the time is to become part of a China-led alignment in the region. Let me say that it's not that there's nothing to this. There are already real-world consequences to Chinese willingness to defy what we would call a US-led global or regional order. For example, one of the main reasons why Iran was able to come through the period of maximum pressure during the Trump administration was because the Chinese chose to ignore the sanctions, or at least part of the sanctions on Iran, and chose to continue to purchase illegally Iranian oil in large quantities from the Iranians during that period, giving the Iranians a kind of safety net where they knew that things weren't going to get unbearable for them because there would be still sufficient or still money coming in from Chinese illegal oil purchases. So that's the beginning of a process. The Iranians see that process. They'd like there to be a lot more of it. They'd like much more Chinese presence so they can be much more defiant. And that's what Raisi is asking for. And of course, in his own way, he asked for it by behaving as if it already exists. It doesn't quite already exist, but there is evidence for it, and Raisi wants to broaden and widen that situation.
And I mean, we know, we can see what the Iranians want. Do the Chinese, are they taking a very political view here? Are they lining themselves up as anti-West? So we'll be friends with everybody who's against the West, or are they perhaps playing a bit of both sides here?
I think they're playing both sides, Alan, because the Chinese do still, as we discussed earlier with David's question, the Chinese do still trade very heavily with pro-Western and Western-aligned countries in our region. Saudi Arabia is a major supplier of oil to the Chinese. The United Arab Emirates, Dubai is a major source for trading for the Chinese, a trading hub for the Chinese. Israel, as we discussed, has major relations with the Chinese. Now, the thing is that, with all due respect or such respect as is appropriate to the Islamic Republic of Iran, the fact is that the countries I just mentioned, Israel, Dubai, UAE, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, have much, much more to offer to the Chinese than Iran possibly can. And none of the troubles that come potentially with close association with Iran are associated with association with those countries. For example, at the end of the day, China is not all powerful. China can't just choose to ignore all US and global sanctions unilaterally without coming in for a very severe economic consequences for itself. So the answer is that the Chinese, I think, will try to continue as long as they can to sort of be trading and friends, so to speak, or involved with everybody. But there is a sense in which, as the parameters of a new global Cold War become more and more apparent and more visible and more solid, it will become increasingly difficult or impossible, perhaps impossible for countries to continue to hedge their bets. if America comes to Israel, if America comes to the UAE and says, look, you can't just hedge your bets anymore. There's a global Cold War on. We need you to either align with us or to align with the People's Republic of China. The answer of UAE and Israel will be obvious. And at that point, China itself may then need to draw conclusions, and there'll be a sort of process of polarization. We're not there yet. The Chinese don't necessarily want it, but it may well be the way that the world is going. What do the Chinese want? I think ideally what they want, as far as I understand them correctly, is they want to just continue to peacefully expand and draw in more and more and more power and become more and more powerful without anybody challenging them. They'd like America to just quietly decline and them to just quietly grow. But since that's not the way it's clearly going to work, I think that the kind of more polarization in the region is a likelihood in the years ahead.
Well, yes, and they're inadvertently being drawn into the Middle East conflict. And would that be something that surely they realise this, but you wouldn't think that that's really what they want, would you?
They don't want it. I mean, I at one time had some quite close talks and so on with the Chinese embassy here, and I travelled to China on a couple of occasions and had talks with their strategy people in Beijing and so on. My general impression of their response to this Middle East conflict stuff is they're just bewildered by it, terrified by it, and want to stay out of it as much as they can. I think you guys are familiar with this as well. The Chinese want more than anything else to deal with stable governments. They don't care what the alleged ideology of the government is. My sense of them is they don't really have any respect for any ideology other than the Chinese themselves. I think everyone else is a bit strange. So they're kind of cool with that if you want to believe in Islam or Hinduism, wherever else you want. They do expect you to provide stability. They don't want a situation where they invest a large amount of money and then, for incomprehensible reasons to them, stability collapses and their investment is lost. So that's my sense. They don't want to get involved in conflicts. Generally, what they've done on the global diplomatic level is they've just followed the Russian lead on Middle East conflict issues, whether it's Syria or Iraq or elsewhere. They vote with the Russians on the Security Council and they stay out. They certainly don't go in for military commitments, even on the advisor level in any Middle East conflict. They're very, very careful about that. My sense, having looked closely at some of the stuff they've been up to, is they sometimes, by the way, make use of the North Koreans as proxies. When they want to sort of go in and have a look around or maybe help out a bit militarily, you tend to find North Korean delegations popping up in weird places. And the sense is they wouldn't be doing that without a sort of Chinese, not a weird, wink and a nod. But generally the Chinese are frightened, if I can put it that way, by Middle East instability, and their instinct is to try to keep out of it. That's been my sense with them.
Yeah, just one more from me, a little bit from a local angle, and then we'll open it up. I'm in the state of Victoria, Melbourne's in the state of Victoria, and our leftist government in the state flirted with China's Belt and Road initiative, only to have this overruled when the feds found out about it. Is this what Iran is looking to get involved in?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is what Iran wants to be part of. And when Iran tries to get in the years in which it was still trying, it's now succeeded to get into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the way Iran would try to sell itself was as a potential trade hub. As what the Iranians would say is, well, you've got member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that are landlocked, such as Tajikistan, for example, and they want to get their goods out to the Arabian Sea, and they can do it through Iran. They can come through Afghanistan, they can get to Iran, and they can get out to the sea. So Iran sells itself as a useful trade hub on the belt, as part of the Belt and Road. It wants to say we can be a hub on the Belt and Road as the Belt and Road goes out from China on its way to the Arabian Sea, or potentially out from China eventually on the way to the Mediterranean. By the way, in this regard, something which I think a lot of the analysis misses is that Iran today, as I and others have written about extensively, essentially controls the land mass between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea, because it has a contiguous area of control stretching through Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. Now, of course, right now, those countries are collapsed and in states of conflict. In the future, they may well not be. And if you're thinking about a Belt and Road and a trade way through to the Mediterranean, having a country that has a sort of mini empire in the region between Iraq and Iran border and the Mediterranean can also be a thing that can be talked about. So I imagine that's also one of the things they mention to the Iranians. Yes, absolutely, the Belt and Road, central to their considerations.
Okay, we'll take questions in a moment. Just before we do, I'll mention that if you're listening on J-Air, this is a live simulcast of the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. And our guest tonight is Jonathan Spire, and we're talking about the Iran-China alliance and its implications for Israel in the Middle East. Just before we take questions, I'll hand back to David for 1 minute to tell us what's happening next week, and then we'll throw it open.
Okay. Next week, we've got to focus on Canada. We have a spectacular commentator and author, Diane Betterman, wrote a book with the fascinating title, Anatomy of Fake News. And I want to show people who haven't seen it yet that today we had a spectacular victory in dealing with Qantas. This is the official statement from Qantas responding to the advocacy of the Australian Jewish Association. We took them up with certain terminology that they had on their booking system, such as State of Palestine or Occupied Palestinian Territory, and they've backpedaled at 100 miles an hour, and that part of their booking arrangement has been withdrawn. And finally, and I put it in this order so that you can see some success in the advocacy, if you're not yet a member of AJA or haven't yet made a contribution, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, like and follow us on the Facebook page, because we can only do this with tangible support. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, we'll take some questions. I've got Michael, Ron, Helen, Leon and Ian, and Robert, if you've got some written questions you want to insert there, just let us know. So Michael, you were first up, and Jonathan, if you recognise Michael and perhaps me, it's because we chatted to you when you were in Australia a couple of years ago.
I do remember, absolutely, in Melbourne.
So just say nice to see you again, and we'll even if you don't remember us, Michael, ask your question.
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan. It's nice to speak to you again. Look, I was actually going to ask you something about China, but you really touched on it in your presentation. So I'm just going to ask you: has a weak US president and government emboldened China and Iran, Russia, of course? And does a weak anti-Israel democratic administration worry Israel?
Okay, so thanks, Michael, for the question. There's two parts to that question, I think, which need two separate answers, because I do think with regard to China, at least the Biden administration, the record is mixed. I mean, I think, especially from obviously speaking to you in Australia, I think that the AUKUS, the news of AUKUS alignment is a very significant strategic move, pioneered by the United States, and clearly with the intention of I won't say confronting, but containing China. So I don't think that the Biden administration has been tremendously weak with regard to China. I think on the contrary, what they may have done is, by focusing only on China and neglecting other areas of importance, projected weakness elsewhere. That's at least the way I would tend to see it. Now, with regard to the Middle East, very much yes. I think there is a perception of weakness. Obviously, Afghanistan's only in the Middle East if you take a very broad definition of the Middle East, that some people do. Of course, actually, it's in South Central Asia. But the geography is less important. People in this region noted the sort of hasty, ramshackle withdrawal from Afghanistan, certainly concluded that it was a serious defeat for the United States. And that spectacle, without doubt, emboldened enemies and worried friends of the United States in our region. And I do think, and I actually wrote about this in an article in a US paper just after the withdrawal, I think there has been a notable uptick in Iranian boldness following the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think we saw an increase of assassinations of opposition figures in northern Iraq. We saw increased aggression in southwest Syria, coming up to the border with Israel. So yeah, there were tangible results on the ground, I think, of Iranian Iranian action as a result of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Having said that, let me be absolutely clear: I'm not a U.S. citizen, and so I deal with the U.S. as with every other country. They elect whoever they elect, and we try and deal with them. And the fact is that the process of U.S. withdrawal did not begin with Joe Biden. I would say it began very noticeably with Barack Obama. I would say it continued to some degree also under Trump, and I would say it's continuing apace with Joe Biden. So my view, at least, is that US withdrawal, or drawdown is perhaps a better phrase, from the Middle East is a given. It's going to continue. I think it's on a strategic level, and we won't be able to prevent it. I also think we can be okay. We're strong, we've got strong allies, and we can do fine, even with a lighter US footprint, not a disappearance, but a lighter US footprint. So yes, it's happening. Yes, enemies are being emboldened by it. I think we're responding to it effectively too. And I think we stand a pretty good chance of, coming out on top of this, even in a world in which the United States has a much lighter footprint in the Middle East than it's had in the past decades.
Thank you. Ron, please unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening, Jonathan. Very quickly, given Israel's position being caught between China and also American pressure, how feasible is it for Israel to strengthen a strategic alliance with Western-type Commonwealth countries like Singapore and India, perhaps even fomenting a similar type of arrangement as the European Union Horizon program?
First of all, I do think that, I think we already have de facto a strategic alliance with the Republic of India. We also have, as you know, long-standing close security relations going back, in fact, to the 1960s. With Singapore, and that's undoubtedly significant too. But I think with regard to the Republic of India, this is a strategic alliance, and I think that my own view, at least, is that as America takes more of a backseat, these kind of regional strategic alliances are going to become increasingly important. And I think that you can begin to trace tentatively a kind of chain of alliances that will be the structure which Israel will want to be a part of in the years ahead. And that chain kind of begins in India, and goes across to Saudi Arabia and UAE and Bahrain, and continues across to Egypt, and takes in also Jordan, hopefully, and Israel too, and continues into the Eastern Mediterranean, and will take in close alliances between Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and I suspect also France. France is emerging as a more assertive actor in the Eastern Mediterranean. The French are deeply worried about Turkish ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean. So what have you got there? What have we just talked about there? A whole bunch of powers that we would tend to think of as being important but secondary powers on a global level, coming together in order to take care of business in a regional context. And that broadly is where I think we're heading with this. The US will still be, in a way, the kind of ultimate guarantor of all that, but for their own good reasons, the United States sees less reason today to be involved deeply inland and upstream in the Middle East. And in the absence of that, what we need to be going for is exactly the kind of strategic alignments or alliances with such countries as India. And that's the way that's going to shape the future. With regard to Singapore, it's a bit of a different category because, of course, you won't see kind of close potential military cooperation on the ground between Israel and Singapore in the same way that you do already see, I think, cooperation with India on joint counter-terror joint counter-terror responses to joint terror threats, because of course India and we have the joint threat of Sunni Islamic terror in the way that Singaporeans don't quite have. But what you will see with Singapore, and I think also we're already seeing with Japan, with Vietnam, and with South Korea, are increasingly close economic relationships, to some degree based on in the military sphere, although not only. And as a result of that, I hope increasingly visible diplomatic alignments too. So I think we're beginning to see how, I won't say a post-American, we're not in a post-American region, but in a changed region, we're beginning to see the way in which friendships between sort of secondary but strong powers are becoming of increasing importance and centrality.
And Bibi Netanyahu was one of the key people in driving these friendships, wasn't he? So was he on the right track? I imagine he was.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so. I think Netanyahu was extremely had a great deal of foresight in this regard. I think that he noted, he pioneered a lot of this stuff, as you correctly mentioned, with Asia. And I think Netanyahu noted that kind of old Europe, he didn't use that phrase, but others did, the kind of old Western European alignments were becoming perhaps of less centrality. The volume of trade with Asia increased exponentially under Netanyahu. And I think that, the diplomacy follows the trade, so to speak. I think that was very foresightful of him. To be fair, I'd say that, Bennett has also talked about that. Also, prior to becoming prime minister, he was somebody who stressed the Asia connection a lot. Obviously, Bennett also has an international business background. So he's somebody that gets the importance of that. So I suspect this will be an alignment that, or a trend that goes beyond this or that Israeli government, but undoubtedly Netanyahu was a visionary in this respect, I think, to a great extent, and deserves a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. Helen, please unmute yourself, and then we'll take a couple of written questions from Robert.
Yes, I read in one of the communications I get from Israel that the Israeli government or the IDF, I'm not sure which, made a statement very recently that they will disable Iran's nuclear program within the next 12 months. I found it very unusual for Israel to make a statement like that. And if it is true, what can they do?
Yeah, I have to admit that I'm not familiar with the statement, so I'm not sure who made it. From what I'm aware, at least, what I am aware of is that the government has allocated $1.5 billion to Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi to begin to develop a potential Israeli military, to redevelop a potential Israeli military response to the Iranian nuclear program. We are told, at least, that in 2012 such an option was in place, and that the decision was eventually taken not to use it, and that then focus turned elsewhere, and that was allowed to sort of rot on the vine, so to speak, and that we're now, because of the clear absence of an American plan B with regard to the Iranian nuclear program, we're now back to investing in a potential military response. What would it look like? By the 12-month thing, I don't know. I don't know who said that. I certainly don't expect that the Iranian nuclear issue will be resolved one way or another within the next 12 months. I think that won't happen. And if we're speaking on the record, you can write that down, and we'll see in 12 months if I was right or not. I'm confident about that. It won't be resolved in the next 12 months either way. But in terms of what would an option look like, well, the Iranian nuclear program is different to that of the Iraqis and the Syrians, which Israel did destroy, of course, in 2007, and before that in 1981, in that it's spread out. In the case of Iraq and in the case of Syria, you had to take out one reactor, basically, and you'd seen to the program. The Iranian program is not like that. It's spread out, and certainly it's not based on one reactor, and certainly some of the positions, such as Fordow, are very, very well defended indeed. That's to say, they're placed inside mountains under tons and tons of rock. So it's very, very hard to bomb them. And as far as I'm aware, at least, Israel does not have currently the bunker busting bomb capacity, which only the US has, which would enable that to be taken out in its entirety. So I think there are real question marks as to whether a kind of single raid could destroy the Iranian program in its entirety. Questions about whether Israel could do that right now. As to whether a great deal of damage could be done, I think that we are moving in that direction. And I'll tell you why. Everyone talks about Iran surrounding Israel. People say, well, the Iranians control part of Syria, they've got Lebanon, they've got Gaza, that they're surrounding Israel. Yeah, there's something to that. It's also true that Israel is increasingly surrounding Iran. If you look at the countries that Israel is developing close relations with, such countries as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and very importantly also Azerbaijan, right? These are countries that border Iran or are very close to it. Now, one of the problems which Iran has posed, as opposed to Iraq and Syria, is it's a long way away from Israel. If you had Israeli planes that could take off from Azerbaijan, for example, or could take off from UAE, from Saudi Arabia, that would greatly increase the potential that Israeli air power would have for doing a great deal of damage to the Iranian nuclear program. That may well be the kind of way that thinking is heading. As far as I'm aware, at least, we do not currently have the kind of capacity to utterly destroy it with a single blow. And I personally, at least, don't think that the issue is going to be resolved over the next 12 months. Doing any kind of military action against the Iranians with the absolute disapproval, not just indifference, but disapproval of the United States would be deeply complex for Israel and difficult for Israel. So, it's not at all an easy hand that we've got to play. My sense, at least, is that attention is being turned now back towards building a credible military option. It may well not exist. I hope it comes to exist in the next few months.
Thank you. Robert, let's have a question or two from the audience.
Thanks, Jonathan. So just a question that someone said, perhaps Netanyahu developed some of these ties so strongly with other nations as a counterbalance to the United States under a hostile Obama administration. So wouldn't it perhaps be a good idea to perhaps maintain them as a counterbalance in case there is a hostile US administration? And that ties in with another question, another statement that the Chinese have never had a history of anti-Semitism. So couldn't they be a potential partner in the long term?
Yeah, Phil, with regard to, broadening the scope of Israel's diplomatic portfolio, which Netanyahu certainly tried to do, yeah, it is important. And I totally agree. One of the reasons is because in a changing United States, the notion which people used to say to me 20 years ago when I was in this country, when I was just getting into all this stuff, and people would say, look, our foreign relations are basically about making sure we're okay with the United States. If we're okay with the United States, nothing else matters. And if we're not okay with the United States, nothing else will help. Yeah, that was 20 years ago. I think the world has changed since then. I think we're aware of that. And certainly, there is a usefulness in having alternatives given the increasing, I won't say unreliability, but the changing nature, let's say, of the United States. So yes, I think that's absolutely right. Having said all that, and this is my answer to the second question, there isn't any substitute for the United States in Israeli foreign relations. There can be subsidiaries, there can be useful subsidiaries, but there isn't any substitute for the really unique and uniquely deep and uniquely wide relationship that Israel has with the United States, also on a civil society level, not just on a military hardware or strategic level. What do I mean in practice by that? Look, during the second, as people here, I think know, during the second Intifada, it's very possible that Israel could have been facing United Nations Security Council sanctions at certain points during that period of conflict. And there was no way that was ever going to happen because of one reason and one reason only, and that was the United States veto on the United Nations Security Council. Now, no other permanent Security Council member could have come anywhere close to providing such a guarantee. It's certainly not China or Russia, and not France or the UK either. So that's just one example. But whenever I talk to people from deep within the security infrastructure here, they'll tell you, no, when it comes to weapons development, when it comes to weapons procurement, especially in wartime, there's no substitute for Israel for the United States. So of course it's good to have correct relations with the Chinese as far as is possible. But as I said at the beginning, if there's going to be a Cold War globally between China and the United States, there is no question but that Israel will have to and should align itself solidly with the American interest, with all the caveats and questions about that. There's no issue there. That's what will happen, and that's what needs to happen.
Okay, we've got Ian and Leon. So Ian, if you please unmute yourself, and while you're doing that, I'll just mention to anybody listening on J-Air that if we disappear from your radio programming, it's because you need to go to the ads and the news right on time. So thank you for joining us. Now, Ian, please ask your question.
Yes, thanks very much. I divide my life between Israel and Australia, so I'm very interested in your conversation with regard to both countries. You mentioned that there's a sort of collusion, and has been for a while, between China and Russia. With respect to both Israel and Australia, could you comment firstly on Chinese aggression in the North China Sea and towards Taiwan? And secondly, the attitude between China and Russia with respect to the fact that Russia is allowing Israel to bomb Iranian targets in part of Syria against Iran, which is in Israel's interest?
Sure. Well, look, with regard to Taiwan, I mean, of course, I think we probably all agree, frankly, you know, with all due respect to us and our Middle Eastern concerns, that this is the single most important strategic question in the world today. You know, is the question of the Chinese attitude towards Taiwan and the possibility, to put it bluntly, of Chinese military aggression in Taiwan, and the question of whether the Americans could or would act militarily to defend Taiwan. There's nothing more important to global security today than that question, because of course, you know, according to certain scenarios, if Chinese aggression on Taiwan were to take place, you've got the potential of a peer-to-peer conflict between the Americans and the Chinese. I read recently that the Americans war gamed this, and they found that the American arms would be defeated if an attempt was made to defend Taiwan militarily. So this is very, very gravely important indeed, not just for us, but for the whole world. Is the question, of course, that naturally follows on from that is Chinese aggression imminent or likely? My own sense, at least, but this is just, you know, well, just my own speculation. We know that the Chinese have a goal of having a navy ready to face the Americans on the high seas by 2049, right? The documentation's out there. That's something which they are gradually and slowly building. The Chinese generally aren't given to acts of strategic recklessness. There are a few examples of that. They're slow and methodically building up a capacity to be ready for the time when it's needed. So a sudden sort of military grab for Taiwan would be deeply out of character. It doesn't make it impossible, but it would be deeply out of character. My sense is that the Chinese, you know, have the sense that they are the rising global power, and they don't want to have any sort of hiccups along the way. They kind of tend to think of themselves as inevitable, and they're gradually and slowly building that capacity. So I don't think that a sudden grab for Taiwan is likely. But we, and certainly you guys in Australia, but certainly everybody, should of course be looking very closely at that and at deterring that, because the potential results of that would be catastrophic. With regard to Syria, it's a much more clear picture, and it is that the Chinese don't really care. At the end of the day, the Chinese don't have any investment. They have a very tiny amount of investment in Syria. The Chinese exchequer is not losing a single cent as a result of Israeli actions against Iranian military capacity in southern Syria. It's just, you know, it's a blip on their horizon that is barely visible to the eye, if I could put it from their point of view. They don't care. They tend to follow the Russian lead. They much prefer a situation which they've currently got, where it's the Russians who are kind of getting dirty on the ground in Syria, or at least in the skies above Syria, and the Chinese just aren't there. The Russian relationship with Israel and the Russian calculation that it's okay for Israel to keep bombing against Iran is good for Israel, by all means, apparently okay for Russia too. And I'm sure the Chinese couldn't really care, you know, either way. That's my sense of it, at least. It's just not that much a major consideration for them, precisely because they've been careful enough to keep out of these local scraps, as they would see it. They don't need to be thinking that carefully about those details.
Okay, we'll take one last question, Leon, if you're quick. So please unmute yourself, and you are, so ask your question. Leon? I don't think his microphone is connected. Okay, look, on that note, we've come to time, so we'll wrap it up. Jonathan, some of what you said was quite worrying, but you do manage to put a bit of a positive spin on there towards the end. So hopefully we can be a little bit more optimistic with what you've been discussing. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for joining us.
Most welcome.
And it's been a delight to have you. And now, where do people see any of your work if they want to?
Yeah, well, most of my articles that I publish, I also put on my website, which is easy to find. It's jonathanspire.com, and there's a whole archive of articles. That's an easy one-stop place to see my stuff if people are interested. And elsewhere, Jerusalem Post every couple of weeks has a piece. The Australian every now and then when I can put something in there. Wall Street Journal every now and then. So a bunch of places, but most of the articles end up at jonathanspire.com. So that's a good first stop for anybody interested.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, we still have the J-Air listeners with us apparently, but if you are in the mood for some more Jewish-themed radio, then you can jump over to 3ZZZ and listen to Morris Klein's L'Chaim program. That's on FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. Until next week, we'll be chatting with Canadian blogger, writer, Diane Biederman. We're going to hear about all things Canadian and see what life is like over there from a Jewish perspective, and also under their Prime Minister Trudeau. So until next week at the same time, we'll bid you all a good night and look forward to seeing you then. So it's good night to you all. Bye for now.